Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.
Welcome to all.
History is made of stories.
In this episode, we'll be talking about software as a service and cloud computing, and looking at how they affect human resources.
SaaS, PaaS, iOS, Cloud, BYOD, IoT. The digital world is filled with all kinds of abbreviations and acronyms, and it isn't always easy to work out what they mean, at least not when it comes to human resources.
The trouble is, we sometimes need to understand their reach and repercussions, which is what we're going to do with software as a service and cloud computing today. What do they mean and how do they affect human resources? What's the story?
Well, for a start, they've become the standard in today's market. The vast majority of HR apps use SaaS. There's no getting away from them.
That influences the choices HR departments make. But before we get into that, let's get back to what the terms mean. For example, which app do you use to listen to music on your phone?
I use Spotify. It's based on the SaaS model. I didn't have to pay for a license to install it, but I pay a monthly fee to use the service. So, SaaS is a model that lets you pay for a service you use online, usually through a subscription, instead of just buying a license.
There's nothing groundbreaking there. We've had application service providers and on-demand solutions since the 2000s.
SaaS is just a method of selling an outsourced IT service, and Spotify is a SaaS.
And there are plenty of business-oriented examples too, including management apps like Workday and Cornerstone.
And then there's cloud computing. Microsoft Azure, for example, says cloud computing is the delivery of computing services, including servers, storage, databases, networking, software, analytics, and intelligence over the internet, the cloud. So, what's the difference?
The cloud is a generic term that covers the remote use of computing power without really knowing where it's coming from.
The cloud covers computing solutions that can include a whole series of services, along with the software. Servers used to host that software, data, and storage of that data.
Or just part of those services.
So, SaaS is cloud computing, but cloud computing isn't necessarily SaaS.
When you rent a hosting service, servers and storage, that's the cloud too. We sometimes use the terms infrastructure as a service or platform as a service. It's basically computing infrastructure, but that isn't software as a service.
So, the provider of a service sold to the end user as SaaS can either host everything through their own computing infrastructure, meaning there's just one provider, or they can outsource to other providers. iOS and PaaS providers.
Which means you have a main provider, plus the providers the main provider outsources to.
And all of that comes under the umbrella of cloud computing. The important thing to remember is that the cloud covers any type of computing service used remotely as an on-demand service. SaaS is part of that.
But all of that has its repercussions. The whole outsourcing issue is a bit of a minefield. When you use HR software through software as a service, with the computing infrastructure outsourced to a specialist, you have a provider who's outsourcing without necessarily telling you who things are being outsourced to.
That raises a number of issues, especially when it comes to accountability in the event of a problem. It isn't easy to read between the lines of contracts. It's hard to understand the relationship between prime contractors, subcontractors, and so on. It takes real expertise to track and secure key processes.
The whole thing's a bit of a minefield. Just look at the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. You've got to know where data is stored, for legal reasons, not to mention security and competition.
So, using a model that relies on a whole chain of contracting parties gives rise to a whole series of complex questions. The outsourcing method has a number of benefits, but it also has repercussions for HR departments.
You need the relevant skills and expertise. They can also be outsourced, but it's helpful to hold on to them and develop them in-house to reduce your reliance on the market.
In any event, you need to know what you're getting into and you need to make informed decisions.
To recap, the cloud covers computing services provided online, which are usually billed on a subscription basis. Software as a service is a version that includes not just the software, but also the computing infrastructure behind the scenes, which might be outsourced. That sort of outsourcing can involve a number of different parties, which means HR departments need the expertise to ensure they make informed decisions. Is that right?
Exactly right. Way to make a long story short. Story RH, the podcast that makes a long story short.